We have Samrat Upadhyaya and Muna Gurung in conversation with Anurag Basnet on whether creative writing can be taught. As a current MFA student who is trying to learn creative writing from an institution, I have always wondered how teaching and learning works in terms of creativity. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Muna Gurung, one of our speakers for this session, is a writer, translator, and educator based in Kathmandu, Nepal. Her translation of Sulochana Manandar's poems, Night, was published by Tilted Access Press in 2019. She has edited 20 children and young adult books. Muna used to write a column called Lightroom Conversations, where she interviewed women and queer writers from the Nepali literary scene, one of my favorite projects by her. She attended Columbia University in New York for her MFA. Our next speaker is Samrat Upadhyaya, a Nepali-American writer with a number of novels and short story collections. He is perhaps the most internationally well-known writer of Nepali origin, celebrated for his debut collection of short stories, Arresting God in Kathmandu, which won the Whiting Writers Award and has been translated into French and Greek. He is head of the creative writing program at Indiana University in the United States. Our moderator for this session is writer, editor, and translator Anurag Basnet, who grew up in Kalimpong. He has had a long career as an editor at various publishing houses, including Rupa Publications, Penguin India, and Speaking Tiger Books. He has translated 2 books, Is That Even a Country, Sir, by Anil Yadav, and The Free Voice, on Democracy, Culture, and the Nation by Ravish Kumar. Please give a warm welcome to all of them.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on Can Creative Writing Be Taught? It's very nice and wonderful to be here on this beautiful day. The venue, of course, is brilliant, and hopefully the discussion that we have today will, if not break new ground or be controversial or whatever, will kind of at least give us room for thought, especially to younger people who are looking, or I find a lot of young people who want to know what creative writing is, what writing is per se. I don't, as we were discussing yesterday, I don't really also understand the word creative writing, because all writing is creative. And also a very warm welcome to the very young audience here. This is so cute. Okay, so can creative writing be taught? I think it's a very provocative kind of question here, given that both our panelists are teachers of writing, teachers of creative writing. So what we had kind of decided is to turn this around slightly, perhaps, and first talk about what teaching creative writing actually means, right? There's a certain degree of abstruseness sometimes, I think, when we talk about teaching creative writing, because there's this sense of an author as like a shaman almost, right? Somebody who sits in a room and creativity descends on that person and something magically appears. And there's a lot of waste paper, a lot of crumpled paper, and at the end of it we have a book. But also a book is also a lot of hard work, right, as we all know. So if you could tell us a little bit about the process of teaching writing. So if you
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Anurag. And happy to be here with Samrat, whom I've read growing up and now able to be here. So maybe we can also talk about sort of creative writing and how that brings folks together. So the good or bad news is that I don't teach creative writing, I realize. I don't do the actual teaching of it. What I do in my classes or my sessions or my groups is that I try to create an environment where writers then can feel vulnerable or can feel safe to take risks with their writing. So I feel like my job is not really to teach, but to sort of provide and build that environment. And maybe in a bit we can talk about or dream about what that perfect environment can look like for a writer. But to start with, I realize that I do very little of teaching. I do a lot of reading. I do a lot of giving feedback as a reader. I do a lot of support work. A lot of that is like moral, emotional support work. I do all the things that is necessary, perhaps, that doesn't show up in a curriculum anywhere, but that is so essential to being a writer. And that can later also include about, you know, you as a writer, you have to be able to market yourself, like talk at a panel like this, and not that great about talking about your work, right? So I feel like that's what I do mostly when I'm saying teaching of writing, and less so teaching, like, you know, exactly like teaching them how to write. I mean, that happens, but that happens in a group, I think, by writing and sharing, and, you know. So, I mean, how about you?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me, or is that? Maybe I can use yours. Hello, hello. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming, especially Amro Sanu Naniharu. Really inspiring to see you guys. These are the future creative writers. Yeah, let's clap. अब यो creative writing teaching भने मैले गरेको धेरै नै वर्ष भइसक्यो है, लगभग 20-25 वर्ष भइसक्यो. तर अहिले पनि मलाई चाहिँ sure exactly अनुरागले भने जस्तो म completely sure छैन के हो exactly भनेर है. We हिजो चाहिँ डिनरमा चाहिँ we ended up discussing you know, why do they call it creative भनेर. अब त्यो पनि छ, why call it creative? All writing is creative, even professional writing is creative भनेर. अब मेरो चाहिँ के भने म चाहिँ प्रोफेसनल टिचर एकाडेमिक इन्स्टिट्युसनमा भएको हुनाले मेरो चाहिँ स्टुडेन्टको रेन्जहरू पनि एकदम धेरै छ के. So last semester, just this past semester, I taught Introduction to Creative Writing to freshman students, many of whom are not interested in creative writing at all. They have to fulfill a writing requirement, so they have to take it. So that presents like very different challenge. And then so you have to think about, well, what is the best way to teach these people? Or what is the best, they are probably not going to write a book. And you know, at most they are going to, like, you know, write a few poems or a few short stories. But what I also try to do with them is I try to show link between their creative writing with their profession. So I say that if you write well creatively, that can also translate onto, like, when you're writing your business proposals, because business proposals also require you know, some level of creativity. And कहिलेकाहीँ चाहिँ के हुन्छ भने एउटा उनीहरुको अलिकति यसो स्पार्क मात्र चाहिँ दिन पायो भने पनि that's enough. So if you can just, like, you know, say if you know you read, like, you know, I have a very famous colleague, you read Ross Gay, just one poem, if it like, you know, makes an impression on them, that is good enough for some of these students. But I also teach more advanced students. So, so with the more advanced students, then the idea of safe space comes into play. And I am at times, with some students, they are, all you need is like a kind of you just need to be there. For some students, all you need to do is just, like, be in the presence, and they don't need much. They just want to write. They're already, like, writing at a pretty good level. Some students, and some of even my grad students, they need to, like, fine-tune their skills. So I often find that if I'm reading like a student story, that they're very good in terms of, let's say, characterization. Character ekdam राम्रो छ, plot पनि राम्रो छ, तर अलिकति त्यो वर्ल्ड जुन उनीहरूले बिल्ड गरेको छ त्यो वर्ल्डमा चाहिँ उनीहरूले रिडरलाई त्यतिको इन्भाइट गरेको छैन. सो आई टक अ लट अबाउट लाइक सेन्सेस, हाउ टु इन्भाइट द रिडर इन. So there are various levels that you can approach it with. एउटा कुरा चाहिँ मलाई के लाग्छ भने यो can creative writing be taught भनेर चाहिँ मान्छेहरूले they only seem to ask it in terms of writing. They don't ask it in terms of other artistic disciplines. So people never ask like, can music be taught? Right? Music पनि त टिच गर्नुपर्छ नि. म्युजिक भने पनि त यसै मान्छेलाई नेचुरली आउँदैन. झन् हाम्रो त यो उसको रागहरूको ट्रेडिसनमा त you're spending years learning music. And people never ask like, well, can sports be taught? Can tennis be taught? त्यो पनि अलिकति ट्यालेन्टेड भए पनि मान्छेले प्र्याक्टिस नगरेर त हुँदै हुँदैन हैन. ब्याक स्ट्रोक कसरी गर्ने, यो कसरी गर्ने भनेर त सिक्नै पर्यो अलिअलि. And finally, there is one more thing that I feel is kind of instrumental to creative writing is the notion of discipline. So, हामीहरूको अनुरागले भने जस्तै हामीहरूको उसमा चाहिँ यो राइटिङ भने चाहिँ एकदम बस्यो, म्युजले राइटिङ दिन्छ, अनि त्यसपछि स्वाट आयो, रिभाइज सिभाइज केही गर्नु पर्दैन, त्यो one shot deal हो, त्यसपछि सक्यो. And then either the writer is a genius or the writer is a failure, what have you. मेरो एक्सपिरियन्समा चाहिँ त्यो चाहिँ मैले आफ्नो राइटिङमा पनि देखेको छैन, मैले अरूहरूको राइटिङमा पनि मेरो स्टुडेन्टहरूको राइटिङमा पनि देखेको छैन. So lot of revision, lot of time spent, lot of time spent by your Shihana was talking about it earlier, lot of time spent just with your own writing, just with your own self. So all of these are parts of creative writing.
Right. Thank you, Muna and Samrat, for that very comprehensive answer, which covered many of my future questions. So, anyway, so we've kind of established that writing or teaching writing is number one, of course, about creating safe spaces, which we will come back to later. But to be slightly more specific about the teaching of it, or I wouldn't say teaching, but probably divining in that sense. Teaching creative writing or editing are that way very allied skills, or allied professions almost, right? So, is this enterprise, the teaching of creative writing, about finding stories, finding unique stories, and bringing them out? Or is it just about providing spaces and skills which will facilitate the bringing out of these stories? Because all of us have stories, all of us have something to say, right? That is an essential feature of being human. So what would you say the teaching of creative writing is in that sense? Is it about finding stories, or is it about providing spaces and skills which will facilitate these stories to be born in that sense? If Muna, you could.
You mean the class or the actual curriculum?
Well, not really the structure itself, but the process, because we can teach anywhere. We can teach inside a classroom. We can teach outside in an informal space in an institution. But this idea of teaching something or teaching creative writing, what would you say is it more for? Is it to bring out most newer stories, or providing the skills or the space for newer stories?
I mean, I think it's both and more, if that's a straightforward answer. But a lot of the folks that I work with, okay, so for recently, just day before yesterday, we had offered, I teach at the Open Institute for Social Science, so it's a social science cooperative where we teach, and it's a research cooperative, but we have a year-long writing and research diploma, right? And in that, I mean, I'm not a social scientist, or, you know, I don't claim to be, but the part I teach is writing, and we start with personal writing. The first thing we do, first day of class, is I give them a prompt. I tell them, write about something that no one else in the world has seen, only you have seen. And they get a little bit like, wait, what? I don't know who else has not seen this. But this whole idea is sort of to think about later themselves as researchers and positionality, and also to know that no matter what, you alone, even if you have a twin, will not see the same things and see the same stories, have the same stories, and tell them in the same manner, to understand that, as Shihan was saying earlier, that you alone can tell certain stories, right? But sometimes you don't know that, or it takes a community to sort of, when you share it, to be like, oh my God, that's a great story. Oh, really? You know, because oftentimes I think we're so hard on ourselves. We're just like, yo kasto jhur lekhyo maile ma lekhnai sakdina, like, you know, and त्यहीमै role moler बस्छ नि त. So I think that space is both physical and figurative, right? Like it's a physical space, but it's also a space where folks are like saying back what they're hearing from your stories, so that you can identify better what it is that you want to tell, who is it that you want to tell it to. So it is both gathering stories. There's lots of generative stuff that happens, and then it is also you know, sharing those stories. So, I mean, I think it's both, not only support or stories. I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I also think it's both. And I think it seems like it's, for me, the more I teach, it tilts a little bit more towards helping writers find their voice. So, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So, sometimes I find that a lot of my students are writing things that they are not truly interested in, and it's a tricky thing, right? Because you can't tell someone, well, this is not what your interest is. But there's a kind of with these students, there's a kind of an attempt at writing, and it might even be interesting in some level, but it doesn't have any heart, and it doesn't have any sort of a core energy. And so for these students, I find that, you know, I might find, well, hey, what about this particular side character that, you know, it seemed like this character had a lot more substantial thing to say about what you're writing in here. And sometimes that is the thing that really works, you know. And then, oh yeah, I'd always wanted to write about that character, but somehow I thought that that was not important, that I was supposed to write about this. So tied to this is also what I find with a lot of young writers, and also with some of my MFA students, is that they have a tendency to see what's trending, right? So what is the trend? What are people publishing these days? What are people writing? And maybe if I write like that, then I will be able to, you know, publish. And to me, that's like a very strong no. That you should never write according to what the publishing industry wants you to write. Because the publishing industry wants you to do a lot of different things, and that's not who you are. Okay, so you have to write what is at your heart, and sometimes with the students, it's actually just the challenge is to help them find that, and oftentimes you don't succeed. Sometimes you succeed, and then there's a lot of joy in me as a teacher. I also find that, so for students who have already found like a certain kind of a voice, then I think then you can start working on like other skill sets. So the example I gave earlier about characterization, setting, and all of that, those things then can be like taught in a very conventional way, and that student will do well. But there's also a danger with some of my students. I had one student who was a big fan of the American writer Raymond Carver, who is like a sort of a legend among creative writing community, in the U.S. in particular. I mean, he's like sort of the, he's like the post-Hemingway writer. So this guy was writing Raymond Carver stories, and he was writing these Raymond Carver stories perfectly. But they were bland stories. There was nothing you could actually critique in terms of craft, because Raymond Carver was a great craft person. But there was no energy, there was no heart to the story. And so part of my challenge with that student was also helping him, find that voice. And I've also found that there's student writers whose work is kind of messy, not all put together, but it's hugely exciting. And I know that that's the kind of writer who will probably 5 years down the line, with some proper training will go on most likely to publish a book.
Okay, thank you. Very specific question to Samrat. Before I come on to the next question, just to kind of segue from what you were saying, as a teacher, how far do you handhold your students after they've kind of gone through your course, passed out, Okay.
So how far? Well, the program where I teach is not necessarily geared toward publishing, and so that also becomes a kind of a tricky thing. So. Some students think that, we have a 3-year program at Indiana University, and some students think that year 1 is when they come into the program, year 2 is when they write the book, year 3 is when they get published. And that never happens. It hasn't happened. I mean, well, students have been published within the first 3 years, but it doesn't work in a logical way like that. I'm also a little bit hesitant to immediately press for publications or emphasize publication with my students, most of whom I feel still have a few years to go before I think they'll produce a substantial work. I mean, I have been surprised. Students have gone on to write, but I think sometimes the overemphasis on publication leads to students pressurizing themselves to write certain kind of stories. I'm sure you all have heard about the workshop stories, that sort of a thing. Also, it's a little bit deceptive in the sense that publication is really hard all over the world. US in particular is extremely competitive. And I think it'll be deceptive to tell the students right away, well, if you do this is what will lead to publication. Because none of the writers I know have had a kind of a straightforward trajectory to publication. They all have come at it from different ways. Some writers have struggled for 10 years and then published a book and have had a good career. Some writers have published immediately after MFA, and then they just kind of fizzle out. They don't go on to publish. So each writer has a very different track. So just emphasizing the publication is not helpful. Now that being said, I actually invite we have had a number of alumni who have been quite successful. So I invite them to speak to my class. And I think these individual stories are a lot more powerful and inspirational. And so I have one alumni who has a logbook of all the rejections. I have a logbook of all the rejections that I had. I thought mine was long, and this guy has the longest of logbooks. And sometimes for my current students, that's a good instructive moment, right? You see oh, it's not that easy. I mean, so I've started doing that. Sometimes, well, last year I invited an agent to speak to my MFA students, and I think that was quite instructive. She talked about what is the way to go about finding a publisher once you have a manuscript ready. But then you have to have a manuscript ready. And I think writers should take their time in getting their manuscripts ready.
Right. So coming to the question of feedback, right? So one of the things that has been dinned into me as an editor in my training is that offering feedback too early, as we were talking yesterday, offering feedback too early sometimes can be stifling, right? When I commission a work, I usually get two kinds of authors: somebody who's not willing to show his or her work till it's absolutely finished, and there are some who want to show me every chapter. And I keep telling authors that, when you're happy with it, you show it to me, and then we'll see. But the whole premise of creative writing courses is based on this kind of constant feedback, what you call workshop, the workshop model, right? So how do you respond to that? This idea that something should be finished before it's shown? Should it be, right? Is it necessary to be complete before you kind of show it to a friend, or to expose it in that sense to criticism? Because writing is also something which is intensely personal and also intensely, for the lack of a better word, egotistical. I would be very, very, very possessive about what I write. So how do you respond to that from the point of view of teaching creative writing? Because as you were talking, Muna, you were saying that it is a very collaborative process. So how do you respond to that?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks for that. I wanted to add, and it ties to your question. I think when I say I'm quote-unquote teaching creative writing, I'm basically also teaching how to read. I realize I spend 80% of my time teaching how to read, and to read, actually. There are lots of writers who write and don't read. And so that's one. So with feedback, when I was going through my own MFA, what used to happen was you would submit your work, and then you would, and like you said, it's terrifying because it feels like you're naked. And then you have to sit in a room with 12 other people. And in my time, they were all, I think there was no one from South Asia. Like, they were mostly white writers. And then they just say really random stuff sometimes, and not that helpful, but whatever. Like, so you have to be quiet for the entire hour while they sort of dissect your work, and at the end you have sort of this moment, right? And I used to think that was not helpful, depending. I mean, that's helpful if, like you said, you're ready and you're going to publish tomorrow, and you as a writer are not anywhere, right? Like, you just let the reader do whatever they need to do. But the kind of workshops that now I've changed that model is when you're in process and you're writing, the writer should be in control of what kind of feedback they want to get. So, for instance, I'm really struggling with this part. Like, can you help me? Can you figure it out as a reader so that it's more instructive and guided by the writer rather than the reader? And I feel like that feels safer for the writer and more instructive for the readers, and therefore makes for a more valuable, wholesome workshop rather than just dissecting something and you're like, wow, like, I didn't mean that, like, I don't know where you're taking it, and everyone feels hurt, right? So I think that's where I have sort of do a lot of the writer submits the work but says, I want you to look at X, Y, and Z, and has a little note at the beginning almost. And then the feedback happens for an hour. Everyone has to write letters. It's like, dear Anurag, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's a certain thing, And then at the end, after a week passes, the writer has had chance to look at all the feedback letters, and sort of decompress from that hour-long workshop. Then I have a very long, hour or two long coffee session with them, and we just debrief the workshop, and then we say, okay, where do you want to take this next? So it is very, I think, laborious, but also I think we have to learn as writers and teach younger writers how to be generous, how to work in a community, how to support each other. Like you have to. I think I know I don't believe in the genius. I don't know.
So, sorry, call me old-fashioned. Just sounds very painful.
So I'm going to use the phrase bread and butter, which is what we were laughing about yesterday. So the workshop is my bread and butter, so I'm going to defend it. No, but like you said, Muna, I mean, pretty much that's what. So the workshop model has evolved over the years. As you know, the Iowa, Writers Workshop was the one that generated the whole idea of, the writer sits quietly while the 12 people, sort of throw all these critiques. And we found that really isn't as helpful as we thought it was. So we've modified that, I think. My students also write letters, but I'm increasingly beginning to suspect that the writer never reads the letters because sometimes it's just too painful to read the letters, right? So in terms of feedback, yeah, I think some feedback can be immensely helpful. So so your question, Anurag, was like, is it too early to give feedback? I think at times, yes. And there are some times when I tell the writer just keep writing, Right. One thing I also tell writers these days, which seems to kind of run contrary to conventional wisdom, is I say volume also matters. So it's not, if you focus on just one pristine story that is then going to make you like a bestseller writer, that also never happens, okay? You have to write a lot, so you have to write 100 pages so that then you can extract 10 pages out of that is really good. And this, sometimes students are surprised because, they're like, oh, volume also matters? I thought it was only quality that mattered. Well, quality comes out of a lot of writing practice. Yeah, it's true. I think it's true that feedback can be hurtful at times. Personally, for me, I also went through the whole creative writing school. So I did an MA in creative writing. I did a PhD in creative writing. And I thrived in the workshop. I loved being in the workshop. I loved reading other people's stories. I loved reading. I loved listening to what they had to say about my work. At times, I would listen to it and just not that important. And at times, so out of 5 comments that they make, 1 would hit the mark. Sometimes someone would say something and I would be immediately dismissive of it. And then 2 weeks down the line, then I would say, oh, maybe there's some truth to what that person was saying. So, it has its pros and cons, I would say. I think the more you listen to criticism, the more you also build a certain kind of a writerly stamina, which then becomes important for the long haul. So you're not you hear just one small criticism and then you just don't go hide into your room unable to write for 1 week, right? Yeah. So I think it has its pluses and minuses.
But I mean, I do agree that I think you have to think about kollai share garne, koile share garne, right? If
right.
you're not you might think, oh, my partner, I love him or her so much, they're the best, and maybe they're not the best person to share that first draft with. I think you have to understand who.
The idea that we're all writing for some ideal reader in our mind, I think that always stays. But of course, the fact that something being ripped apart before it's fully formed sometimes may not work. So we've talked a little bit about the form of the creative writing. Let's talk a little bit about the content. Now, what I'm going to put out here is maybe slightly controversial, but that's okay, I'm sure. Over the last century or so, we've seen the privileging of a certain kind of writing. Linear narratives, things have to fit into each other. Especially, I think, a lot of American writing which has come here, very linear, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, it begins, ends. There's no cyclical, and there's not much in terms of how memory is dealt with. But a lot of South Asian writing today now is kind of breaking free of that form. I think we're Indonesian writing, writing from Pakistan, writing from India also to a certain extent, is...
Okay. That's a really tough one, Anurag. That's a... I think, at least in my experience, I think you're right about your assessment of, linearity versus non-linearity in terms of, American writers versus, let's say, South Asian writers. Although I can immediately, when I said that, I think of a number of American writers too, who are, especially writers of color. You think of like someone like Toni Morrison, who doesn't write linearly at all, right? And so in creative writing, I think there was a tendency. So I'm again a little bit of a historical perspective here. I think it goes back to the workshop. There was a tendency earlier on to like focus on. So I think like the Raymond Carver type of stories were very linear, well crafted. But there's been a movement away from that. And at least in terms of my creative writing classes, we at the MFA level, I'm getting students from all different backgrounds. So the Indiana University Creative Writing Program is quite well known for having a lot of writers of color, non-binary writers, who tend to write like what, the kind of things that Anurag is talking about. So yeah, I think one of the things that I have felt as a creative writing teacher is, and I think Muna alluded to that earlier, how much learning we ourselves are doing and how we have to also adjust our teaching methodology as well as like a sensitivity to the students' work as we teach. So I think my teaching of writing has also evolved over the years. For example, I'm a fairly realistic writer, although my forthcoming books are not strictly realist. But a lot of my students are not writing realist work anymore. A lot of them are writing fantasy. A lot of them are writing dystopian or magical realism. And so as a teacher, I've also had to adjust my my sense of how do I teach. So I've gone out and read some of the works, even though that's not a genre that I write in. So yeah, there is a sense of adjustment that's necessary. Although I think I'm beginning to see more nonlinear writing among my students.
Sure.
As you were asking that question, I was thinking of myself as a young writer भन्नाले स्कुलमा अनि SLC को अगाडि चाहिँ त्यो यस्तो proverbहरु हुन्छ नि त्यसलाई चाहिँ घुमाएर there's like a Nepali proverb and you have to write 5 pages on it to get 5 out of 5 points, right? And it was always about के भन्छ length instead of like analyzing it or whatever. And so I, as a younger, I guess, student, I was trained to write very verbose, long things. That's what my Nepali teacher taught me. When I went to the States, they were just like slashing through my pages because it's like, no, concise, short sentences. That's sort of this American kind of way, right? But now I think I do agree with Samrat that there's a lot of different kinds of literature, like even from the US that's emerging, maybe from mostly writers of color, that are like a mix between a song and a novel, and like, you know, and there are lots of those stuff which I'm sure you're aware of. And I also want to harken back to my role as a translator too. I think when we read other literatures, like for my case, Nepali literature, and as I was translating Sulochana's poems, I found myself as a translator beginning to also edit some of her poems,
right.
And then thinking like, how does this stand in the current English poetry scene, kind of thing. And then I had to step back and question, wait a second, like, who am I to decide what she's doing is wrong or,
right.
you know, like archaic or whatever. So I think it's an ongoing thing. And I think, yeah, there is no real answer, but I think there is a movement for sure away from it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. I have someone from the sidelines showing me a placard saying Q&A. So we should, I think, possibly, I mean, this is a discussion that is ongoing, and there were a couple of other major questions that I wanted to ask, but I think we've run out of time, and you also have a flight to catch. So if there are any questions from the audience, we could take them quickly. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? First off, thank you so much. I just stumbled across this when I was walking on Lakeside, so this is really great and feels like a huge sign. In terms of, I feel like, Samradji, you talked about getting the agent, when you brought the agent and they told you about how to get to publishing. Can you hear me now? Okay. So it feels like, to me, this world of writing and everything, it feels to me that you write and you stay here, and then on the other side of the lake is the publishing and everything, and I'm missing a boat to get from here to there.
Yes.
And it feels like a completely different world and a completely different universe to how do I get to the other side of the lake? You know what I mean? So is there like any sort of guidance, anything? You know, it can be US publishing or Nepali. Like, yeah, I feel like I'm without a boat at the moment, and any sort of rope or anything to get to a boat would be helpful.
Should I take that question from the Indian publishing point of view? Yes. Yes, it is. There is a chasm, as Akshay also will vouch for, and partly the reason is that publishers have, unfortunately, made themselves inaccessible. That is true. Publishing is a business. There are things to be done. There is a turnover to be achieved. But the resources, especially today, are very little, right? Editorial departments across the board, across all companies, are strapped to the extent that people are howling in pain. Let me just put it like that. And therefore, inaccessibility becomes a fact because there's just not enough manpower to read new manuscripts, right? So we have something which is unfortunately called the slush pile, right? So there are any number of authors writing in with their manuscripts, and mainly because there's such little manpower, the slush pile, that pile doesn't get looked at, right? So which is where this whole culture of approach, of mediation, of agents, etc., comes in, because then you have someone who knows someone who knows someone, right?
Exactly.
So I would say that yes, it is the industry's fault in that sense of, by making it inaccessible, by making itself inaccessible, we are also not discovering the kind of stuff that possibly should be published, right? But also, to defend the profession and my industry, it is also because there is a very little bandwidth. And increasingly that bandwidth is getting lesser and lesser. And I don't know how it is in Nepal. I'm sure it's the same, but we really need to kind of all get together and talk about it and see how we can fix it, because increasingly we are becoming this kind of echo chamber where, you know, only what is brought to us gets published, and the ones which are and everything else becomes an outlier, right? So I hope that answers your question. It doesn't help you, but
it's even more disheartening, to be honest.
yes, I know.
Because
it is disheartening for us as well. You know, on a daily basis, it is quite heartbreaking, because now and then you come across something which is so startlingly good, but then, you know, there's not enough space, there's not enough bandwidth, you don't have the resources, money, paisa chaina, you know, big problem always. So yeah.
I have to say, I love the metaphor of the lake. You just like, it's right there, Barai
right there.
Temple. There's someone, you know, the boat. It's just like perfect. So you will get published.
Thank you.
Take my word for it.
That's huge encouragement. Thank you. Just to follow up on that, Anuragji, you know how you were saying slush pipe or whatever, and then the good things don't get read,
Right.
and then if you know someone who knows someone, and those are the writers that get published, and those are the, I don't know, like, it almost sounds almost towards you have to know someone to know someone, or like almost a nepotism. And then somebody might have a brilliant idea, brilliant perspective. Writing is all about showing your perspective to the world, right? And then that perspective never gets seen. I believe that we are, none of the creative things that come to us is ours. We're just vessels to transmute it to the world, right? And then it depends on
Right.
who you are, or where you're born, or whatever, how many people you know, or how you're connected within this interweb of human beings, to be able to be like, okay, so this is the perspective that needs to be heard. And
I know what you're talking about.
How
Yeah.
any sort of role.
The idea of gatekeeping is a big problem in publishing. What you just said, that there is somebody sitting there who decides what gets published and what doesn't get published, right? The only, you know, what I can say, how I would respond to that is, number one, of course, is persistence, right? So you keep writing, and you keep talking to people, and you keep sending your work around. Possibly it might be easier in Nepal because the industry is smaller, and but there are also resonances, and there are also sometimes situations where what you've written resonates immediately with someone.
Regardless,
right?
yeah.
Regardless
somebody has
of
to read it.
Yeah, that's one way, which is, you know, which kind of brings in God and providence and all of those other things. But the other thing is that, you know, we all need to also collectively, I think, sit and think about what are the other ways in which we can get our work out there. Is this the only way? Perhaps that is a question that is also to be asked. I'm not sure whether, you know, publishers will agree with me on this, but if there is a bottleneck happening, perhaps we should find other ways to address that bottleneck, honestly speaking, because a lot of work is getting ignored, a lot of work is not getting its due. That is also true. So perhaps that is a question that needs to be debated more than, you know, more than who we know or what we know.
Just to you know, there is most of the writers I know have not become published because they know someone. Okay, so
That's a huge relief.
Sorry.
That's a huge relief coming
Yeah,
from
they send their stories out, and it takes some time, though. I mean, that's the thing. So it's not going to happen, you know. So they send their stories out, and sometimes the story resonates with an agent, and so we have an agent call you. That happens. You know, in my case, I was sending out stories. One of my stories got picked up by the Best American Short Story. The publisher called me saying, "Hey, we like your story." You know, so these kind of stories happens all the time. So there's no reason to be, discouraged. I think it's just a question of timing. Sometimes writers are very impatient. And for naturally, I think young writers, because they feel like they have a voice, there's a kind of I was very impatient when I was young, I'm still impatient. But, there's a lot of good news too that can happen. It's a very competitive world. You have to be, attuned to that. So
there
I think this gentleman had a question.
I think we have time for one last question because we have 5 minutes left.
Thank you for the time. हामीले जब लेख्नुहुन्छ त्यतिखेर अडियन्सलाई अथवा रिडर्सलाई सर्वे गर्ने अथवा रिडर्सले अहिले के मन पराइराखेको छ, रिडर्सलाई चाहेको चिज के हो छ भनेर राइटरहरूले त्यसरी पनि हेर्नुहुन्छ अथवा लेख्दै जाँदाखेरि रिडर्सले त्यो ठ्याक्कै मन पराइहाल्छ, कस्तो किसिमको छ?
हेलो, आई थिङ्क अघि सम्राटले भन्नुभएको जस्तै त्यो अहिलेको ट्रेन्ड के छ, कसले के पढिरहेछ, के चाहिँ लेख्नुपर्ने भनेर लेख्यो भने चाहिँ मेरो विचारमा चाहिँ एकदमै नराम्रो फेल खाइन्छ जस्तो लाग्छ। म पर्सनली चाहिँ अहिलेको अडियन्सहरूले के मागिरहनु भएको छ भनेर सोच्यो भने चाहिँ त्यो एउटा त एकदमै ठुलो पहाड जस्तो लाग्छ आफू अगाडि, होइन? सो मैले चाहिँ त्यसरी चाहिँ सोच्दिनँ, तर एउटा हरेक लेखकको आई थिङ्क एक प्रकारको अडियन्स चाहिँ हुन्छ, होइन? अब कसैले आफू जस्तै सानो 15 वर्षकोलाई आफू होइन तर अरू कसैको लागि त्यसरी सोचेर लेख्न पनि सक्नुहुन्छ। तर त्यो हुन्छ नि पाठकहरूले के खोजिरहनु भएको छ होला भने चाहिँ आई थिङ्क म भित्र चाहिँ त्यस्तरी सोच्न थाल्यो भने चाहिँ एकदम ठुलो भय छाउँछ क्या, अनि त्यो लेख्न चाहिँ गाह्रो हुन्छ जस्तो लाग्छ। सुरुमा नै अडियन्सको बारेमा सोच्यो भने देन त्यो त एकदमै पाठकले नै ड्राइभ गरेको हुन्छ नि त। त्यो एकदम सिधा आन्सर दिएँ है मैले।
मैले सोध्न खोजे चाहिँ मैले लेखिराखेका किताबबाट अडियन्सले के सिक्दैछन् भन्ने कुरा पनि राखिन्छ अथवा आफ्नो मनको कुराहरू मात्रै लेख्दै गइन्छ भन्ने पनि थियो।
अडियन्सले के सिक्दैछन्?
मेरो लेखाइबाट अडियन्सले के सिक्ने, कुन जेनेरेसनलाई सिकाउने, युथलाई अथवा चाहिँ ओल्ड एजलाई अथवा बच्चाहरूलाई मेरो लेखाइबाट कसले के सिक्ने भन्ने कुरा पनि छ, अथवा तपाईको मनमा जे आयो त्यही लेख्दै जानुभयो अनि अडियन्स जुन एजकोले, जुन ग्रुपकोले, जुन एथनिसिटीले जसले जे सिक्न मन लाग्छ त्यो सिक्दै जाओस् भन्ने छ।
भर्खर अनुरागले पनि भन्नुभयो, आई थिङ्क त्यो त्यसैले नै त्यो अघि हामीले भनेको थियो नि, त्यो तपाईँले लेखिसकेपछि जब तपाईँ तयार हुनुहुन्छ त्यतिखेर चाहिँ कुनै पाठकलाई देखाउनुहोस् आफ्नो मिल्ने वरिपरिको अरू अथवा लेखकहरू, होइन? अथवा यदि तपाईँले सानो बालबालिकालाई लेखिरहनु भएको छ भने म त भन्छु उहाँहरूलाई नै लगेर सुनाउनुहोस्, उहाँहरूले के भन्नुहुन्छ त्यो कुरा सुन्नुहोस्, अनि त्यो कुरा सुने पछाडि चाहिँ देन तपाईँले नेक्स्ट ड्राफ्टमा चाहिँ अब के हुन्छ नि आफैले मिलाउने हो, निकाल्ने हो, थप्ने हो चाहिँ त्यो चाहिँ ठ्याक्क तपाईँलाई थाहा हुन्छ होला। तर त्यो चाहिँ रिडिङ अनि फेरि फिडब्याक, फेरि प्रतिक्रिया, फेरि पढ्ने प्रतिक्रिया, ब्याक एन्ड फोर्थ चाहिँ तपाईँले अलिकता गरिरहनुपर्छ। मैले चाहिँ त्यसरी लेख्छु, एक्लै लेखेर चाहिँ भोलिपल्ट तुरुन्तै पब्लिस हुने चाहिँ अहिलेसम्म लेख चाहिँ मैले लेखेको छैन। तर आई डोन्ट नो
एउटा डेन्जर त्यसमा के छ भने त्यो अब पाठक भने त्यो मोनोलिथ एउटै मात्र हुँदैन, होइन? पाठक भने एउटा पाठकले यो मन पराउँछ, अर्को पाठकले मन पराउँदैन। मेरै किताबहरूको उसमा पनि अरेस्टिङ गड वाज ग्रेट बट आई हेटेड द गुरु अफ लभ भन्छ है, अर्कोले अरेस्टिङ गड आई हेटेड बट आई लभ द गुरु अफ लभ। हु एम आई गोइङ टु, अब कसको उसमा मैले लेख्ने, होइन? त्यो आफ्नो उसले लेख्ने कि ऊ गरेर लेख्ने, त्यो चाहिँ अलिकति डेन्जरस नै हुन्छ। पाठकको उसमा चाहिँ गरेर लेख्यो भने पाठकले केही सिकिरहेछ भने त अब तपाईँको राइटिङ चाहिँ राम्रो रहेछ र कम्पेलिङ रहेछ भने पाठकले सिकिहाल्छ, होइन? मेरो उसमा चाहिँ मैले एउटा चाहिँ अलि पावरफुल स्टोरी मैले बताउन सकेँ भने त्यो नै चाहिँ सबभन्दा ठुलो इन्स्ट्रक्सन हो। मैले चाहिँ त्यसमा चाहिँ त्यो उसले बसेर मैले के सिकेँ भनेर नेसेसरी चाहिँ पाठकले के सिकेँ भनेर नेसेसरी सोच्या भनेर विचार गर्दिनँ। पाठकले इन्जोय गर्यो कि गरेन, पाठकले चाहिँ क्यारेक्टरबाट क्याप्टिभेटेड भयो कि भएन भनेर अब maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's faulty, but मेरो लागि चाहिँ one of my biggest compliments is like if someone says, Samar, I picked up your book and I couldn't put it down.
To me, that's like, oh, I managed to say something. I mean, you proceeded with it.
I think we've kind of run out of time. Sorry, sir. I've been. Do we have time for one more question? I'm about time up, but. Anyways, maybe we could take this. Yeah, we can. Okay, thank you. So I think we should. I'll just make this little announcement. Samrat here has to catch a flight. He has to go back to Kathmandu. So if you could all excuse him and of course thank him for being here. A big round of applause for Nepal's best known writer. Thank you so much, Samrat.
Okay. My question is, there seems to be a prevailing wisdom that pain, suffering, your own internal struggles, if that is subject matter of writing, you shine. It seems like the pain and suffering actually cleanses you, it purifies you. My question is, as a writer, do you agree with that or not? I mean,
well, see, pain and suffering has been a subject of writing for forever, right? Viktor Frankl's book, In Search of Meaning, which he wrote after his time in a concentration camp, in which he took his suffering and made it universal. I think my personal opinion is, if pain and suffering is something that you use to connect with the universe, if you connect with others' pain and suffering, and if you gain an insight from your pain and suffering which might be of use to humanity somehow, yes, I think that's right, and that's a good subject for writing. But if it's pain and suffering which doesn't resonate with anyone, if it's only for you, perhaps it may not cleanse you, it may not, it may not do anything to anyone. But certainly, if you think, if you connect with the larger world, and if your pain somehow resonates with at least one person, and it helps them, yes, why not?
You know, I mean, only very brief, quick comment. Essentially, you look at the lives of, authors, Sylvia Plath, Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, Hemingway himself, and in numerous different pages. You see, they have gone through a lot in their life. It seems like it comes out, it oozes out of their soul, But at the same time, I myself am not really sure that really is the perfect one quick answer, So that's
I understand, sir, and I'll probably take it up with you when we're off stage, because we've been, the next session is on. Thank you so much for being a very kind and engaged audience, and thank you so much for hearing us out very patiently. I hope what we said here has been of use to someone, and our little audience left early, it wasn't of use to them, but more power to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anurag.